Welcome. I'm Chris O'Connor, Professor of Medicine in Cardiology here at the Duke Clinical Research Institute in Durham, North Carolina. And I'm pleased to have Dr. Catherine Flynn, who's Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and works in the Economics and Quality of Life section of the Duke Clinical Research Institute, who was the principal investigator for the quality of life assessment of the HF-ACTION trial. And Catherine presented this at the late-breaking trials at the recent American Heart Association meeting. And we're fortunate to have Catherine in the studio today to give us another presentation of this, a repeat presentation, and then we'll engage in dialogue about the meaning of this important sub-study. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you. So to begin, the goal of clinicians treating heart failure patients is not only to prolong life, but also to improve patients' quality of life. And as Dr. Whelan mentioned, exercise training in heart failure has been studied for about 2 decades now. But few of these studies have assessed health status. That includes patient-reported symptoms, functioning, and quality of life. In the studies that have been done, the effects of exercise training on health status have been inconsistent. Some of the studies have shown improvements for patients in exercise training, but often it has not been more than what's seen in controls. And finally, exercise training is recommended in the ACC, AHA, and European heart failure guidelines. However, the studies on which these recommendations were based have some limitations. There are limitations in terms of their generalizability. This includes selection bias of patients, small sample sizes, and studies that involve a single center. Other limitations include a short duration of exercise training that's evaluated, or variability in measurement tools, especially when it comes to health status. And also, most of these studies were undertaken prior to the current guidelines for beta blockers and ICDs. So our objective in the HF-ACTION Substudy was to examine the impact of aerobic exercise training on health status in patients with stable chronic heart failure due to systolic dysfunction. Our primary hypothesis was that exercise training will significantly improve the health status of heart failure patients compared to usual care alone. The health status instrument that we used was the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, or KCCQ. The KCCQ is a 23-item, self-administered questionnaire. It's a disease-specific measure, and it has a number of subscales, including physical limitations, symptoms, quality of life, and social limitations, among others. We administered the KCCQ to participants in action at baseline every 3 months for the first year, and then annually thereafter for up to 4 years. The KCCQ is scored on a scale from 0 to 100. Higher scores correspond to better health status, and a difference of 5 points has generally been considered clinically significant or clinically noticeable. And this is because it corresponded to cardiologists' ratings of small change in health status over a 6-week period in a previous study. So our primary analysis is a treatment group comparison following the intent to treat principle. We estimated a linear mixed model. This uses all of the available data, and it averages the health status trajectory for each group. And because stratification into the trial was based on heart failure etiology, we included etiology as a baseline covariate in our model. The sample provided greater than 90% power to detect a 5-point difference in the KCCQ score between the groups. We also conducted a number of secondary analyses. These included treatment group comparisons for the KCCQ subscales that I previously mentioned, and we also looked at interactions by key subgroups. And then finally, using the linear mixed effects model that I just described from the primary analysis, we compared the percentage of patients in each treatment group who had at least a 5-point improvement. And we did this at 3 months and 12 months. And using those values, we then computed the number needed to treat. And in this case, number needed to treat is the estimated number of patients needed to be referred to an exercise training program in order for one of them to have a clinically noticeable improvement in health status as compared to usual care without training. So similar to the baseline characteristics that Dave showed, we also had a good balance in terms of the KCCQ overall summary score and subscale scores between the two treatment groups. So the other thing I just wanted to note on this slide is the KCCQ symptom stability score. So this is a subscale that looks at recent changes in patients' heart failure symptoms, and a score on this scale of 50 indicates no recent change in symptoms. And so as you can see, a score of 54 that we see in both of the groups means that the patients were stable with respect to their heart failure at the time of randomization into HF-ACTION. This slide shows the percentage of patients with complete KCCQ data out of the patients we expected at each visit. And so that accounts for death, withdrawn consent, and rolling enrollment into the trial. So the yellow bars represent exercise training arm, and the red bars the usual care group. And differential missing data was not greater than 6% at any one time point. Okay, so here we present the results of the primary analysis. And as a reminder, we used a linear model to predict the underlying health trajectory for each patient. And so what I'll be showing, the lines, represent the average underlying health status trajectory for patients in each treatment arm. The yellow line that you see represents the exercise training group. Along the x-axis is time in months, and the y-axis shows the KCCQ score. So what you can see here, first of all, is that a strict linear model was not the best fit for this data. And so the shape of the curve that you see is explained because we used what's called a piecewise model, where we included a joint at 3 months. And so what we'll be showing is change from baseline to 3 months, and then change from 3 months to the end of study. So here you can see in the exercise group, there was an initial improvement of 5 points on the KCCQ, and that improvement was sustained over time. I've now added, with the red dotted line, the trajectory, average trajectory for the usual care arm. You can see that this is also improved at 3 months, but as on a smaller amount. Here it's 3 points, and that improvement, on average, was sustained over time. The overall treatment effect, that is, the difference between the trajectories by treatment group, was significant at p equals 0.001. And this result supports our primary hypothesis that exercise training significantly improves health status in exercise for the exercise group compared to usual care. Furthermore, this improvement happened early, by 3 months. The difference of 2 points between the groups at 3 months was highly significant. And importantly, the difference between the groups did not attenuate over time. The p-value for the difference in slopes after 3 months was not significant. There was no difference between those slopes after 3 months. And though I'm not showing it here, the differences that we analyzed for the KCCQ subgroups basically looked the same. There was an early change that was larger in the exercise group and was sustained over time. The overall treatment effect for each of the KCCQ subscales was also significant at p equals 0.02 or less. Okay, so this slide shows the same model that we just showed to predict, or uses the same model that we just showed to predict change in the KCCQ at 3 months. So what you see here is the distribution of change in the usual care group with change from baseline along the x-axis. The vertical white line that you see is what indicates the 5 point. So for usual care, about a third, a little less than a third of the patients in usual care had at least a 5-point improvement at 3 months. This green distribution that I've added is the exercise group. Over half of patients in the exercise group had at least a 5-point improvement. More patients had clinically meaningful improvement at 3 months in the exercise arm than in the usual care arm. This slide shows the same analysis only at 12 months. Both distributions are a bit more spread out, but basically it's the same pattern, where we had more patients in the exercise arm than usual care who had clinically meaningful improvement at 12 months. And so here, we're just showing those differences between the distributions. So the percentage of patients with a clinically noticeable improvement, that is 5 or more points, in the KCCQ overall summary score at 3 and 12 months. So at 3 months, it was 54% of patients in the exercise arm versus 28% in the usual care arm. That difference between the two groups of 26% was highly significant and corresponded to a number needed to treat of 4. And that is to say that, on average, for every 4 patients referred to an exercise training program, 1 of them would have a clinically significant improvement at 3 months, as opposed to being treated with usual care. And it's a similar story at 12 months, 53% versus 33%. The difference between the groups was 20%, which was again significant and corresponded to a number needed to treat of 5. We did not find any subgroup interactions. You can see here the ones that we looked at. And we had a number of limitations. The first was incomplete capture of KCCQ data. The second one was also mentioned previously, and that is that suboptimal adherence in the exercise training group and increased physical activity by the usual care group may have diminished the health status benefit associated with exercise training in the trial. The third is that because of the nature of the HF-ACTION trial, of course, blinding of subjects and research personnel was not possible. And finally, the KCCQ assessment schedule, while it was frequent during the first year, was somewhat limited after 12 months, where we only collected it every year. So in conclusion, the HF-ACTION trial is the largest, most comprehensive study of exercise training in heart failure, certainly the largest that's been done to include health status. Participation in an exercise training program produced a modest but statistically significant improvement in health status compared to usual care. This improvement occurred early during supervised exercise training and was sustained during home training. These results were consistent across the KCCQ subscales and across multiple subgroups. These findings are also consistent with the safety and benefits of exercise training that we saw in reducing clinical outcomes, further supporting its use in this patient population. Thank you.
Catherine, congratulations. This is an enormous effort again to look at quality of life in this large a cohort of heart failure patients over such a prolonged period of time. I'm not sure there's been a larger study using the KCCQ, and I wonder if you could tell the audience how did you choose the KCCQ? We're starting to see this more in clinical trials as opposed to the Minnesota Living with Heart Failure scale. And what advantages do you see in that particular scale?
Sure. So it is certainly, to date, the largest trial that's used the KCCQ. And we chose it. It was a relatively new instrument when we chose it for this trial. But it had been shown to be a more sensitive measure, more sensitive to change. And so we thought it was important, though it hadn't been used as much at the time, to use the KCCQ as it was a more sensitive measure. And certainly in the last 7 years, it has grown greatly in popularity.
Well, quality of life is so important in heart failure, particularly as we begin to see a ceiling on the ability to reduce hard endpoints like morbidity and mortality. And we get a little bit of this in HF-ACTION. We have a modest reduction in the composite endpoint, really no reduction in mortality. It's being driven predominantly, it looks like, by heart failure hospitalizations. And so then I think when you have a modest clinical result, the quality of life results become more important. Are your findings, do you think, consistent with the clinical signal?
Yeah, I think they certainly are consistent. In both cases, we saw modest improvement. And depending on how you looked at things, it was or was not statistically significant. But certainly with the KCCQ, we had highly statistically significant results. The magnitude was modest. I don't think you can say anything more than that.
It was really quite consistent, I think, with the clinical events, except one observation. And as I see these results, again, I think of more issues. The quality life separation occurs relatively early. And if you look at the separation of the clinical events, it looks like it's occurring later. So, and the sustainability, which is very interesting, I would have expected that over time, one might have lost a little of the advantage of the quality life difference. Can you sort of explain that to us?
Sure, that's an interesting observation, I think. One thing, like I said, I didn't show was the subscale, the results by subscales. And the subscales that we examined included two that are more physical, including the physical limitations and symptoms. And while we saw a similar pattern across all four subscales, it was actually in the non-physical subscales, that is the quality of life subscale and the social limitations, where we saw a much larger absolute improvement. Now, that happened in both groups. The difference between the groups was consistent at around 2 to 3.5 points difference between the exercise training and usual care group. But there is definitely a component to this study that there was improvement early, and it was not just physical improvement. And in addition to that, it was sustained, on average, sustained over time.
So exercise, which we've all thought about, is that not only do you feel better physically, but you sort of feel better overall, sort of your cognitive, maybe your mental health, other non-physical aspects of quality life improve also, is what your findings show, which seems consistent. Now, when I start an exercise training program, I sort of feel terrible for the first couple weeks. Did we see any people who got allocated to the exercise training's quality life actually worsen, and do we know anything about those people?
I mean, certainly, when I showed that distribution of changes in KCCQ, there were people who had negative values.
Negative values.
That's
yeah.
right. It was a much smaller percentage,
right.
Of the distribution than people who had no change or positive values. But yes, there are some people who had even quite significant decreases.
Worsening. That'll be an interesting group. I will admit I wasn't in the trial, so it
right.
wasn't me that contributed to that. The whole issue of the sort of new way to look at quality life, and that is how many people got over this threshold of 5. We've heard of this magic 5 number, and that you might describe a little bit about how that's come about. You got to get to 5, but if that's a threshold, I was intrigued by your number to treat analysis. We usually think of that as 10, 15 patients to treat to get a survival advantage. This is a number to treat to get over the 5, which is, I think, an interesting way to look at quality life. And I hope that you can elaborate more on that, but I hope that other people look at that sort of methodology. I know that was exploratory, but it does make sense to think about how many people you need to get an important improvement in quality life.
That's right. So I guess two points there. The first is that, as we said, this is a relatively new measure, and I think it hasn't been used as often in a more stable population, a younger population like we had, and the study that was done to produce that value of 5 was based on cardiologist ratings over 6 weeks, no treatment involved, just of how patients had changed. And there were 476 patients in that study. Of course, the vast majority of them had no change. And so the number of patients that had change that was noticeable was quite small. And so I think the weight that we give that 5, we could consider that certainly, especially in a healthier population.
Yeah.
And the other, with the number needed to treat analysis, that certainly is exploratory. I don't know that I've seen it done in quality of life, but I think it does, give the absolute magnitude difference, 2 points between the groups, doesn't sound large. But if we're going to use that 5 points and percentage of people who are reaching that, I think it is quite interesting to see that so many more patients in exercise training reached that.
Reached that, yeah. And a number to treat of 4 or 5 is considered very good by
That's right.
traditional standards of other therapies that we look at. So that was, I think, an important point in all of this. If you were to, well, let's talk about the modeling, and then we'll go to the last question. But the modeling analysis is important because of missing values, people die, people get hospitalized.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what that model does?
Sure. So the reason we chose the model is because when we're measuring something at baseline every 3 months, every year, we know we're going to have missing data. And what the model does is, instead of just analyzing people who have a certain amount of available data, it's able to use all of the data that we have by looking at the trajectory of each individual person. So if they have a baseline value and they have a value at 6 months and a value at 12 months, it can look at where is that patient basically going. And it also allows us to weight those people who have more data more heavily in our average, the overall average of the health status trajectory. So I think it's the most appropriate model we could use to really utilize all of the data that we have, and to get a good estimate of what is going on, accounting for death and people who drop out and people who started the study later.
Yeah.
So
later. And then the final question, I think, is, again, if we say that 50% of the patients seem to have crossed that 5 bar,
mm-hmm.
that's roughly about how many patients actually adhered to our exercise prescription. Could you sort of give us your thoughts on what the quality of life differences could look like or might look like, in your opinion, in those who took the full amount of exercise that were, really adherent to the protocol? Do you think the differences will be greater?
I think they may be. Certainly, this is the type of intervention that if it's making someone feel so awful, you would not be surprised that they stop or do less. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it would be surprising to look at people who continued to do it at the level that was recommended, that they really were feeling worse. I think we will see that they feel even better.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for being in the studio today, and thank you, everyone, for listening to the results of the quality of life, main results of the HF-ACTION trial. This has been a landmark effort conducted by the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute under the project leadership of Dr. Lawton Cooper. Over the past 7 years, Dr. Ileana Pena and Steve Catane, along with Dave Whalen and myself, comprised the leadership committee. Dr. Carrie Lee was the chief statistician. Dr. Kevin Schulman and Catherine Flynn and Shelby Reed have worked on the economics and quality of life aspects of this important trial. And we're thankful for all your efforts, everyone who participated in this trial, patients, study coordinators, investigators. And we hope that this will be a trial, be information that will be helpful to your care of heart failure patients. Thank you.